Hi, this is Paul. I've been wanting to make a video about this for a long time. And this video is about the relationship between metagelicalism and the emergent church movement. This was prompted in me when I was reading more of Richard Beck's blog, and I found a series that I had missed back in March of 2024, which is entitled Why the Emerging Church Movement Failed, Part 1. What was the emerging church? Now, what he does here is he recommends a podcast that was out back in March called Emerged. If you remember, there was a lot of hotness around podcasts, especially the rise and fall of Mars Hill, and then the podcast about J.K. Rowling. Justin Brierley, of course, started his podcast about the surprising belief. On one hand, podcasts are ubiquitous, but every now and then someone tries to do a really tight, highly produced series, and that's what this Emerged series was supposed to be and do. Now, it certainly did not get the kind of splash that the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill or the J.K. Rowling's podcast got, and I don't think it's too... Both those podcasts were... well, we can talk about those podcasts in other ways, but this was not up to that standard. Okay, I'll just say that. It is... But there's a lot there to chew on, and I've been making my way through it and really sort of trying to understand what we've seen going on in metagelicalism now, this little corner, and Peterson, Peugeot, Paul Kingsnorth, Vervaeke. I mean, all of the different ways that we are doing things with this emergent movement that was in the late 90s, early 2000s, sort of following on the seeker movement, and it rose and fall. And this movement is it's fairly short-lived. And there are reasons why it's short-lived. Now, it's Friday afternoon, and it's almost 5 o'clock, and my wife will be getting home from work, and so I don't have hours to devote to this today. I hope to come back to this next week. I hope to give the podcast a little bit more attention, but because I thought maybe the easiest way to get into it would be to start with Richard Beck's blog. If you have no idea what the Emergent Movement is or was, you might want to peruse the Emerged Podcast's website, where there's a helpful timeline. Oh, let's go there. Is it still up? So some of this stuff is no longer up, I've noticed. They tried to make make this into a really big deal. Doug Padgett, Nadia Bolz-Weber, Brian McLaren all participated with the podcast. Of course, Rachel Held Evans passed away a few years ago. Here's some of the other people involved in it. Where's this timeline? Okay, 1992 to 1997, proto-emergent. Outreach to Gen Xers who weren't going to church. One of the things that I noticed in the podcast is that So I remember a lot of this history. I came back to the United States in 1997 from being in the Dominican Republic, and so I missed a lot of the early run-up to this. I didn't fully appreciate what was going on with the seeker movement. I was in seminary until 90, and I left the United States in 1990, and I came back to the United States in 1997. And when I came back to the United States, the church world was very different. When I came back to Classis Central California, I came back in August, and they told me our whole Classis is, every church in our Classis is sending a team to Willow Creek to their church leadership conference. And I was like, okay, so I'll go. And myself and a handful of other people from church went to the Willow Creek conference, and I'd never seen anything like it. And so we actually took another group back the next year, and we tried to implement some of their things. Nothing ever fit at Living Stones. I mean, when I first got here in 1997, okay, we're gonna turn this church around, and we're gonna use all of the tools that are available to us. And so seeker church tools, cell church tools, emergent church, I mean, you name an off-the-shelf way of turning a church around, we tried. This church would not be turned around. This church was just way too itself, way too authentic, way too exactly what it was, and I suppose me too, and would not be churched around. So sort of the ramp up is in 1997. But I remember I talked about some of this with Nathan Jacobs. Maybe I'll append some of those videos to it, because the emergent conversation also came up in my conversation with Tim, the woodworker, because that was he very much had a lot of emergent vibes, as does Nathan Jacobs. And so this was a very big thing moving through. It was a rejection of boomer evangelicalism. It was very much Gen X. And I remember going to Willow Creek, it might have been the first time, they had this Axis conference, which was Dieter Zander. I remember that name when I was talking to Nathan Jacobs, but I wasn't sure about it, so I didn't want to use it. But now in reviewing this material, Dieter Zander had this little church within a church at Willow Creek, and that was supposed to be Gen Xers, and this was very neo-evangelical. Neo-evangelicals have always been big on psychology, and so you can read that in Molly Worthen's book, The Apostles of Reason. So they thought, psychologically, we've been studying the boomers and we sort of have them cased, and the seeker movement is the way to sort of bring in the boomers. So we're going to study the Xers psychologically and sociologically, and we will craft the cultural aspects to hit them as well. And of course it was, as this podcast says, well, we're just going to deal with the particularities, but the heart of the gospel stays the same. And so it's a very tricky thing. And part of what the emergent movement wanted to do was talk about theology as well. Theology for them wasn't off limits. So the Young Leaders Network was a key part of this. And I've got Church on the Other Side. I read that book. Of course, I saw The Matrix. I read a bunch of Brian McLaren books. We could talk about that if we want to. The Ooze, I remember reading The Ooze quite regularly. So many of these churches had the same name: Jonathan, or Solomon's Porch, Jacob's Well, Mars Hill. There were all these sort of Bible names. A lot of the seeker churches were much more like Granite Springs, Willow Creek. They were much more suburban. If you go into a new development, we've got lots of them around Sacramento. You go into a new development, just look at the street names, or you look at the names of these little subdivisions that they make. The boomer churches had those names. The emergent churches had much more Bible-ish names, and they'd use these evocative moments in the Bible, like Jacob's Well is where Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman. Solomon's Porch was where they'd have debates outside the temple. Mars Hill is where Paul addressed them. And so, again, it's no accident. And Driscoll comes up early on in the podcast, but then when he bolts from the movement, see, and the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement is part of the emergent movement. It's, in fact, been, I would argue, one of the most successful parts of the emergent movement, even as Young, Restless, and Reformed denies they are part of the emergent movement. And I was listening to the podcast when the emergent movement starts getting attacked, almost primarily by the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement. I mean, they've got audio of John Piper not being terribly nice. I'll say it that way. And so this is a critical part of sort of the story of Christianity, and I would say the coming apart of the old neo-evangelical coalition into today, where you basically have the progressive evangelicals and then much more conservative groups that are, how to talk about it. But again, I think this is a big piece of the rise of orthodoxy. And that's where someone like Nathan Jacobs is so interesting, because again, I'll clip the part of our conversation where we talk about that if I have time. And because once I start making these videos, I just keep going. I tell my wife, I say, honey, I'm making a video, so I'll be home soon. So 98 to 99, this thing moved fast. So they had this leadership net, and that was very much, I guess, that there's this guy with deep pockets who was funding that thing. Again, when I go through the podcast a little bit, if I do that, there's some really interesting moments in there that are so salient because you can just see the cultural differences between, let's say, the modernist seekers and the postmodern emergents. And of course, postmodernity and postmodernism were postmodernism was sort of this thing. If the neo-evangelicals found psychology and sociology and said, ooh, these are tools that we can use to evangelize, the postmoderns or the emergents read postmodern and said, wow, this changes everything. And it changed them. So the Young Leaders Conference, and then you've got, I remember. So I was back in the United States by this time, and I had been to Willow Creek, and I had the internet, and I start reading books, and in many ways, I was much more easily emergent than I was seeker, because there was a mercenary instrumentalist quality to the seeker movement that I just couldn't sort of stick with. And that was true, I think, of most Christian Reformed ministers. There was just sort of a pragmatism to it that we just thought, this doesn't feel like putting first things first. But then the emergent movement comes, and it's much more gritty, much more angsty. Of course, I'm a late boomer. Probably internally, I'm a little bit more Xer. And so I always felt a little bit more at home with the emergence. And in fact, Rachel Held Evans and we exchanged emails sometimes because I would respond to her blog, and then she would write me back, and we'd go back and forth, and never met her in person. But then as the movement developed, I began getting more and more critical of Rachel and of Brian McLaren and of Rob Bell and a lot of the emergence as it moved on. So 20 to 22, 2000 to 2002, Meet You at the Cohort. Gen X Religion, New Kind of Christianity, Tale of Two Friends, Brian McLaren, Pneuma. Oh, I remember Rob Bell's Pneuma series, yeah. And you've got some of the stuff going global over to the UK. And, all right, Emergent Village, I remember that. Emergent Conference, I never went to any of the Emergent conferences. Blue Like Jazz, Emerging Church, Dan Kimball, he's right down in Santa Cruz. The Shaping of Things to Come, Alan Hirsch. Boy, I read a lot of these books. Generous Orthodoxy, Emerging Church, Velvet Elvis. After I'd read 2 or 3 Brian McLaren books, I had sort of had enough. And so 2008 to 2011. So by this point in the movement, I was probably done with it. Peter Rollins, Luke in many ways is very emergent. I had written a blog post on some of Rachel Held Evans' books. Of course, Nadia Bolz-Weber came on the scene, Diana Butler Bass. So all this stuff, and Love Wins. But by that point, by 2011, 2012, I had already started, at least in the CRC, started making noise and saying, hey, we're going to need to have a confessional. We're going to need to have confessional conversations about all sorts of things, because it was pretty clear by that point that it seemed to be the left wing of the emergent movement was moving into the main line. 2006, I sort of discovered Tim Keller and followed Tim Keller fairly closely between 2006 and 2010. And then again, by 2012, I was sort of done with Keller and was starting to turn my eyes back to the CRC and saying, our denomination is heading for a shipwreck over, human sexuality and a whole bunch of these other issues that were sort of at the heart of the emergent movement. And then, of course, by 2017, I bump into, or probably 2015, I bump into Rod Dreher online, 2015, 2016. 2017, I bump into Jordan Peterson online, and I start making videos in 2017, and there we've gone since there. So maybe if I dive into that podcast at some point, I can flesh out a little bit better for some of you who know. I'll put the links to all of these in the notes, and you can kind of go through and read Richard Beck's posts if you want to, because Beck is just excellent. Beck is really good. Why the Emergent Movement Failed, Part 2, Searching for Sunday. So Doug Pagic, Solomon Porch. So one of our church plants was named Solomon's Porch. The church plant failed. I mentioned in the last post how the peak of the emergent church conversation coincided with the golden age of blogging, and that's vitally important because at that point I was reading a lot of blogs. Now I've started reading more Substacks now. I've started leaning into Substack. I haven't written a lot on Substack, but I've been playing with it a little bit. And the internet is key for the emergent church movement. That somehow people are now connecting, but it's very much, what was it, as Internet 1.0? We're not yet to Internet 2.0, because I think, again, in a lot of ways, a lot of the vibe of emergent church is in the TLC, but again, it's all changed. So now, in many ways, a lot of people who were going emergent went Orthodox and some of these ways. Consider as one example how many of the early leaders of the emergent church conversation who were pastors left their churches to become authors and conference speakers. And, you know, even though I didn't consciously do this, I think this has been part of the reason why I didn't take a turn in 2018 to say, okay, Living Stones, you're on your own. I'm going to lean into this YouTube thing and I'm going to grow my channel big. And I remember coming across Rachel Held Evans' blog and seeing writer, speaker. And I was thinking, who the heck are you? Why would I want to read your books or listen to you talk? Now, again, she sort of takes off on blogging and she gets all of her clout via blogging. This is the beginning of social media where you can become someone. And this is, Paris Hilton and Kim Kardashian. You can become famous just for being famous. And that was sort of the early days of this. And so people were leaving their churches and they were writing books and they were starting conferences. And of course, this was also sort of the end of the church planting, the great church planting movements that COVID then finally really killed. But the church planting movement, so people were first planting seeker churches and then they were planting emergent churches, and the emergent churches would have all these different things. Of course, my friend Rod Hugin's been on the channel. You could see him as emergent in a lot of ways, but they sort of stayed confessionally small O Orthodox and stayed CRC. So in a lot of ways, Rod and the Village in Tucson, Arizona is quite metagelical. But these people were sort of leaving. They discovered now via the internet they could have new careers as celebrity Christians and wouldn't have to have the inconvenience and hassle and drudgery and trauma and complexity of an actual church while they were out being celebrities. Recall the emergent church was largely an evangelical phenomenon. And in the early years of the movement, the emerging church would lean upon evangelical support networks and structures. At the start, as I shared in the last post, the emerging church movement represented itself as a missiological movement, as an evangelical attempt to reach postmodern culture. As long as the emerging church kept its focus on cultural analysis, how to evangelize Gen Xers and millennials, it was welcome and necessary conversation among evangelicals. If the kids wanted smells and bells, let's do that. If they wanted a more relevant and authentic Christian experience, let's give them that. If they needed to carry more doubt and uncertainty, let's teach them to embrace these questions. The goal seemed to be evangelistic. Let's figure out a way to reach the postmodern culture. Books like Blue Like Jazz and Velvet Elvish, which exemplified this approach, became huge bestsellers. Soon, however, leaders within the emerging movement began to endorse or explore doctrinal positions which ran afoul of evangelical orthodoxy. Rob Bell got farewelled for Love Wins, questioning beliefs about hell. Rachel Held Evans fired her shot, A Year of Biblical Womanhood, pushing an egalitarian gender roles in evangelical churches. Soon, LGBTQ questions would become the focus. Evangelicalism Inc. circled the wagons and expelled the heretics. Suddenly, the structures and networks of evangelical support dried up. And that's a key point that shows up in the podcast because in many ways, and I think, again, this is different from the TLC and the metagelical movement that we see happening here. The emergent movement initially was bankrolled and funded and dependent upon evangelical church structures and leaders and parachurch organizations. And the minute they sort of ran afoul of doctrinal lines, cut off. And when the money got cut off, the movement began to wither. Plus you had major players like Mark Driscoll basically, starts out emergent, goes young, restless, and reformed, and eventually leaves that behind and goes, and I should probably listen to a few of his sermons and find out where the heck he is himself now besides just the Mark Driscoll show. And that was always the tension with Mark Driscoll, is that he would be emergent, and then he'd be young, restless, and reformed, and then he'd be charismatic, but everyone was also always looking at him as like, is this about the Christianity, or is this about you and your issues? So that was a key difference. And again, early on in the days of me doing this, people very much wanted to push me in a direction like this, and I sort of instinctively said, no, I don't want to do anything I can't afford. And by afford, I mean afford myself financially, afford in terms of my marriage, in terms of my relationship with the Christian Reformed Church, in terms of my relationship with Living Stones. Those are primary commitments that I have, and those limit what I can do. Because part of what I saw in the emergent movement was people went, all right, well, we're going to be a Christian. We've never had Christian celebrities like this before. And so they all sort of rose, and then the movement's over. Why the emergent church movement failed. Part 3, when evangelicalism became deconstruction. What happened to the church in the emerging church movement? Again, I'm reading Richard Beck's blog, and I'll put the links below. It's an excellent, excellent series. Recall the central features of the emerging church movement was its engagement with postmodernity. At the start of the movement, this engagement had an evangelistic and missional thrust. How can we reach our postmodern culture where suspicions of meta-narratives and institutional authority are prevailing? Simply put, how do we evangelize in a postmodern culture? And again, as the emergent people began to notice, they can't just do what the boomer evangelicals did. Because the boomer evangelicals were themselves, they basically had a evangelical, modernist-shaped religion, which grew out of American fundamentalism, and they just fixed the window dressing. They changed the music, and they said, we're not really changing what's at the heart of this, because if you would go to listen to a Tim Keller, not Tim Keller so much. Tim Keller was, of course, much more young, restless, and reformed. And so Keller was really sort of emergent, but he was the young, restless, and reformed wing of the emergent movement, which again is still intact, where most of the movement is kind of in tatters. I mean, Rachel Held Evans eventually just went mainline. And when she went mainline, because before she was just kind of an angsty blogger that says, I can't find a church that fits me. And that's where, when I started this stuff and I saw these people, I can't find a church that fits me. It's like, I've been listening to this for 15 years. Can't find a church that fits me. Finally, when she found a church that fit her, it was Episcopalian church. It was a mainline church. And it was like, she fits. By that point, most of her views were in alignment with the Episcopalian church. And so, hey, there you go. You found your church. And so to what degree was this a movement of the church? And to what degree was this Rachel Held Evans' own personal story? And so what a lot of the people in the emergent movement began to notice was that the old formulations, the propositional tyranny, the focus on the primary, if not exclusive, focus on afterlife destination, postmodernity is impacting this. And we have to talk about theology. We can't just sort of change the window dressing and hit people with the Roman road, the four spiritual laws, and what will you say after you die to Jesus for him to let you into his kingdom? And in fact, the emergents were right in that America was changing. And while a lot of America, seeker movements, churches still worked, and they still work today, culture is pretty uneven with respect to these things. Peter Rollins gets a lot of mention here, Luke. An example here would be the trajectory of the work of Peter Rollins. At the start, Peter's work in his book, How Not to Speak of God, was a very helpful intervention in helping us talk and think about God in a postmodern context. Richard Beck, I've never read the book. Richard Beck said, I love that book. But as Peter's work progressed deeper into Christian atheism, it became what he called pyrotheology, a call for the wholesale deconstruction and demolition of Christian faith, a burn-the-house-down approach to faith. All metaphysical convictions had to be jettisoned. And again, Peter Rollins, Rob Bell, these are some of Luke Thompson's favorites, and I love Luke Thompson. And he keeps pointing me to Rob Bell and Peter Rollins, and I look at him, it's like, I read a lot of this stuff in like 2000, and I thought about it, and I understood why they were making the moves they were making, but it didn't have a lot of grip on me. They would say, okay, boomer. But again, what happened, what happened was a lot of evangelicals deconstructed, and they were sort of making a lot of emergent noises, but they didn't wind up in church. Who were those morning ear biscuits guys that I made some videos about a while ago? I could look them up, but these, again, I watched a lot of this stuff in the 2000s and the 2010s, and I watched people doing this, and it was like the promise of the emergent church movement was that this was going to now, and again, it's all these implicit narratives and imaginations. They saw their parents, or at least not really their parents, but the generation older, and in the seeker churches, and they saw these seeker churches just explode and boom and just pop up all over, these non-denominational mega churches all over the world, and they saw that, and I think in their minds they thought, we're gonna do this right. We're gonna be the emergent church, and we're gonna have candles, and we're gonna have like soulful guitar solos on acoustical guitars, and we're gonna talk about our doubt and our angst and how Jesus is with us and all of this stuff. And our churches, well, maybe they'll be smaller because the big churches, they're so impersonal and they're so mall-like and they're so modern and they're so suburban. We're going to be inner city, and we're going to be cool, and we're going to be all of these things, and our movement is just going to whoosh. And it didn't, because people had their songs and their angst and their doubts, and they went home and stayed in bed. And the ones who sort of got militant, well, that was sort of the young, restless, and reformed. They were sort of captured by this particular vision of Calvinism, and they were going to go out there and, of course, but you have these elements in the emergent church, and the progressive end of the emergent church, I just don't know if church is authentic. But boy, coffee in the morning sure feels authentic. Why don't we just do that and listen to music and the Bible, Jesus. And so a lot of them just sort of wandered over into kind of a Gen X grungy perennialism. And it's just awfully hard to build a prevailing church network on that sort of thing. And so a lot of people just deconstructed, and no church came forth. And then there was, part of the movement that came with the emergent church movement was sort of and we had a version of, we had a version of all of this in the CRC, but was sort of we're not going to plant churches anymore that do evangelism, because that evangelism and that transformation, that's so Christian exclusive and maybe colonial and maybe bigoted in some way. So we're just gonna start, instead of starting churches whose idea is to plant worshiping communities, we're going to plant churches whose their main idea is going to be to live among the poor and work among the poor. And now I had read through a lot of that and really been excited by that when I was a seminary student, because I was going to Latin America. And so I was reading Viv Gregg and Servants Among the Poor and all of this stuff. And I'd read Liberation Theology. And so I had looked at a lot of that stuff in the 80s. And so then when I saw sort of the emergent church movement get a hold of them in the aughts and the teens, I thought, hey, Livingstone's homeless, racial reconciliation, working with the poor, giving out money. In fact, Northside Chapel in Patterson, and I'm all for helping the poor. But the foundation for that kind of generosity, and this is what I think, Tim Keller really got right. The foundation for that kind of generosity is a transformed heart. And especially in terms of a community, that doesn't mean that there aren't very generous people to the poor and the needy out there, but in terms of establishing something that is really sustainable, and not just helping the poor in terms of here's some stuff, or here's some money, or here's our program in order to fix this particular aspect of you with our psychology and our medicine, and to medicalize it, but actually to look for an internal transformation. Again, something more akin to what I see 12-step programs do. It kind of takes a worshiping community that is a real religious community that has crunchy values. Again, Why the Emergent Church Movement Failed by Richard Beck, Part 4. Theology that got a little too weird. And again, what's interesting about this is that I see elements of this in the orthobro movement. I'm just saying, I do. I mean, again, I've repeated this often. My friend who has a very Anglo-Catholic CRC church that's going well. It's a wonderful church. People would sort of start there, and then they got the sense of, yeah, you're doing liturgy and you're doing the lectionary and you're doing all of this, but you know who's really hardcore? The Orthodox. I mean, they got big beards and black robes, and when they build a building, they put $1 million of stone in the floor, and they, and this kind of Anglo-Catholic CRC church, that's just sort of weak sauce. That's maybe lukewarm. We're gonna go full Orthodox. And so my friend would say, well, God bless you. They, go to an Orthodox church, go to Mass, get chrismated, be a catechumen, be a member. If you're gonna do it, do it. And then what he found was people who left his church, they didn't do it. Oh yeah, if I went to church, I'd go to an Orthodox church. Well, you know what? Sitting home being a grungy, emergent, deconstructed guy is not being in an Orthodox church. You have all these aspirations. You might as well aspire to go to the moon or be Elon Musk or do whatever, because it's just all in your head. If you're going to be Orthodox, go be Orthodox. And you want the rigor, go and submit to the rigor. But don't just say, I can't go to any church that isn't rigorous. And they don't go to any church. So it's like, all right, well, that's not helping you. So at the time, the theological perspectives were exciting and mind-blowing for many people, seismic even. But the ideas tended to be esoteric and theory-heavy, and we certainly know something about that in the corner. Appealing mainly to theological nerds with graduate degrees. At the time, the epithet theobro, see, the theobros became the orthobros, was leveled at this online demographic. Though this tag could be leveled at the young, restless, and reformed crew as much as the emerging church crowd, the theobro was generally a white guy with a graduate degree who liked to argue about theology and social media. Did we ever meet any of those on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server? Can't imagine. You know, just again say Trinity or universalism in the corner, and whoosh, you know, the flames will rise. From the mid-2000s, as the emerging church began to show up on online spaces, there were lots of theobros debating online. I count myself among this group, given how much I enjoyed arguing about theology after I had launched my own blog. And, you know, he goes through some of the other movements that they went into, Rene Girard. And yeah, it just sort of the liturgist. There are other theological trends with the emergent group that we could also talk about. We could talk, for example, about social Trinitarianism and the influence of Jürgen Moltmann, or the popularity of non-dualistic thinking. People like Richard Rohr, ding, 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 ding. You know, John Van Donk, Richard Rohr. For example, we could do an autopsy of how Michael Gungor took the very popular and emergent adjacent podcast, The Liturgist, down the non-dualistic, spiritual, not religious path. And so, yeah, this is, again, and that's where there's so many similarities that I've seen, that because I'm old enough to, okay, I knew the racial reconciliation church movement because I was a part of that. That was really what our church was part of. And, you know, the sacrificial urban ministry model, racial reconciliation early on, and then evangelicalism. And I mean, I've lived through just a lot of these phases. I did foreign missions, and I mean, I've just walked through a lot of this. So then when some of this stuff comes up, it's like, yep. You want to argue about non-dualism? Well, it's out there. Go for it. You want to argue about universalism? You want to do theology? But again, I was not an evangelical that said, no, we're just changing the embroidery on the gospel, but the gospel underneath is the same. And of course, and this is why the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement is, I think, emergent, because they were going to talk about the gospel, and they were going to work on the gospel. And so when you look at the work of Tim Keller or John Piper, you know, that was very different from, let's say Bill Hybels, who, although he grew up CRC, basically had a broadly evangelical Roman road, 4 spiritual laws. That was basically what Bill Hybels would preach. He was a very effective preacher at it, and that worked very well. And then what tended to happen in, let's say, certain corners of the PCA with Tim Keller, and then of course there were Reformed Baptists like John Piper, and you know, a lot of these churches, and then of course the Young, Restless, and Reformed began to have inroads into the Southern Baptist conferences. So the emergent church didn't go away, but basically in the divorce between Young, Restless, and Reformed and Emergent got the name. Young, Restless, and Reformed said, we don't want that name. We don't want to have anything to do with this. We're going to be Young, Restless, and Reformed. And then, of course, you know, we could talk about them as well. And then the last episode of this, why the emergent church movement failed, because they went woke. And again, at first, they were sort of financially dependent on movement evangelicals and evangelical parachurches when they started losing their job because they wanted to talk about theology, and the evangelicals were not looking to have conversations about theology at that level. Well, social justice hit them, and they went just whole hog down the postmodern thing, and that's what sent them to wokeness, and that's when the whole thing really came undone. And again, Richard Beck nicely writes about this. From a social justice perspective, exemplified by the work of Rachel Held Evans as a millennial second-generation member of the Emergent Church conversation, the movement in the mid-2000s was focused on gender justice in the church. Younger than the leaders of the original Emergent network, Rachel quickly became a social media phenomenon among those interested in reforming evangelicalism. Rachel began to demonstrate the power of Twitter in calling out and taking on leading evangelicals. Rachel's fight with Al Mohler, John Piper. See, again, part of what doomed the Emergent movement is the Young, Restless, and Reformed were part of them, and the Emergent and the Young, Restless, and Reformed, they went after each other. It was a civil war. And they were not going to beat the Young, Restless, and Reformed. I'm sorry. I remember one of my Calvin College history teachers, who was fairly progressive himself in many respects, said, talking about Cromwell's army, if you're fighting an army that's singing hymns as they're marching to kill you, think again. Because, the Emergents were, and the Young, Restless, and Reformed were like, hey, we're ready to rumble. You want some of this? We got Mark Driscoll. Rachel Held Evans is taking on Al Mohler and John Piper and Mark Driscoll and Doug Wilson, and it didn't go well. Soon, however, the emergent voices began to be called out by people of color, even Rachel's as a white woman, and then soon after that by queer folks. And again, all of this happened before woke really hit the mainstream. And so I remember when woke was sort of hitting the mainstream, before we even had the word woke, I looked at that and said, that isn't going to last. That isn't going to make it, because this all happened so the emergent people, first they took on the Young, Restless, and Reformed, who would regularly clean their clocks, and then they started getting shellacked from the left. The emergent voices began getting called out by people of color, even Rachel as a white woman. I mean, the Karen meme wasn't around yet when Rachel Held Evans was alive. And then soon after that by queer folks. Events in the culture pushed the conversation deeper into the social justice movement. Trayvon Martin was killed in 2012. The Obergefell ruling came out in 2015. Me Too happened in 2017. The word intersectionality started showing up. Talk of centering people of color voices and talk of white people to check your privilege became ubiquitous. Allies were told to stop talking, asked to listen, to hand platforms over to women of color and queer folk. Emerging church leaders began to describe themselves as activists in their bio. They still do. Largely white and male conference lineups were called out and canceled. To this day, conference hosted by voices once associated with emergent church conversations reflect the impact of these years, when deconstruction fused with social media activism featuring largely female, queer, and spiritual but not religious speaker lineups. Basically, though, we didn't have the word for this. One of the reasons the emergent church movement failed was because it went woke. And you had this woke purity spiral that happened. And, well, all of the sort of the leaders who had emerged organically, who had the right gifts, the right skills, the right messages, the right vibe, all of that stuff that gave the movement strength. Now suddenly, now that they're sort of at the top, they've got to swap them in for people who haven't been tested up from below, and the movement loses its sizzle. And in many ways, the movement just sort of gets overwhelmed by secular. I mean, who wants to have Christians who are just sort of apologetically, because they're just kind of looking over their right shoulder at evangelicals who are about to clobber them? They're in a death match with the Young, Restless, and Reformed, and now they're looking to their left and seeing a whole cadre of secular and others attacking them for just being, white and evangelical. Well, they just didn't stand a chance, and that pretty much ended the movement. And in a lot of ways, you can see why sort of what has developed around us is different. It had to be woke proof or anti-woke, and it's not going to have those same kinds of dependencies. I mean, if you look at who's sort of survived, Nadia Bolz-Weber has, because she's basically owned now and put forward by a mainline Lutheran denomination. But of course, that did not, I mean, that's, they sort of, I should find the wording. Here it is. She's the first pastor of public witness by the ELCA. Would she make it as a non-denom? Now, Mark Driscoll, again, at some point, and this is critical, even to look at someone who has been at the center of a phenomenon, a significant phenomenon like Jordan Peterson. Without individuals, nothing flies. Without institutions, nothing lasts. Part of the reason Nadia Bolz-Weber has lasted is because she has an institution behind her. Mark Driscoll, dynamic guy, but he can sort of live on movement, on conservative evangelicalism and movement conservatism. Jordan Peterson, what long term, and so, okay, so you've got Peterson Academy, and what long term is going to sustain that which he brings to the table? And of course, this is one of the secrets that religious organizations and churches have had, in that if you start a movement, even if something happens to you or you die, to the degree that your spirit gets lodged in that movement, it will go into the future. So the emergent church movement died, and I think in many ways there's a lot of emergent DNA and vibe in the corner. But now it's metagelical. It's gone beyond just, remember how Richard Beck said that was kind of an evangelical thing? I think a lot of that stuff, part of the reason the Orthodox Church has grown is the emergent movement. And of course, the young, restless, and reformed continues on. I think a lot of the others are sort of, if to whatever degree they're still there, they're going to get absorbed into the main line. But of course, the main line is struggling anyway. So the main line is really happy to have them, but they're kind of going from a tiny little raft that is going under and going onto a much larger ship that is also going under. So I'll keep listening to that podcast. That podcast is interesting because, again, I know some of this history. I wasn't paying attention to it because, of course, I had living stones. I had a family to raise. I had a denomination I was deeply involved with, but I was close enough and I was reading enough of this stuff to, in fact, one of the things I have to do is I have to do a book cull, and I've got so much seeker business methodology books and then a bunch of emergent books, and I just bumped into some of them again. It's like, what am I going to do with these books? Because do I just recycle them? Because the truth is, it's done. It's done. And, it used to be that if you would get a chance to write a book, that would be a thing. Now, anybody can self-publish a book. And the real question is, will your book last? So, yeah, before there was metagelicalism, before there was the TLC, there was the Emergent Movement. And a lot of the stuff that launched that. And I think part of lessons from the failure of that are sort of present with us now. So I don't know how many people this video is going to sort of connect with, but I know a bunch in the corner that are going to eat it up. So leave a comment.